Good evening, and welcome to Graycell's studio. Tonight, ambition, power, and murder collide in Murder on Election Night. But before we begin, if you could ask Hercule Poirot just one question, what would it be? Tell me in the comments below. Now, make yourself comfortable, and let the mystery begin. Chapter 1. The night the votes were cast. The village of Ashenford Magna wore its civic pride the way an elderly colonel wears his medals, with conspicuous dignity and a faint undercurrent of desperation. On the evening of the 14th of October 1932, every public house had hung a Union Jack from its upper windows, every shopfront displayed a rosette in either Conservative blue or Labour red, and the ancient clock tower above the market square had been strung, somewhat precariously, with electrical bulbs that flickered in the autumn wind like the nerves of a candidate awaiting his fate. For this was no ordinary election night. The by-election for the parliamentary constituency of Ashenford and Stour had consumed the village for 6 weeks, had divided families across the dinner table, had caused the vicar to deliver 2 consecutive sermons on the Christian duty of civic participation, without once mentioning which party God preferred, though certain parishioners claimed to know. The seat had been Conservative for 41 years without interruption, held latterly by the late Sir Humphrey Davish, who had died in August of a stroke brought on, his wife maintained, by reading the Manchester Guardian. Now 2 men stood to inherit his mantle, and the whole village trembled with the particular excitement of a community that understood, with absolute certainty, that its moment had arrived at the centre of history. Ridgeway Hall stood at the northern edge of the village, separated from the common by a ha-ha, and from respectability by rather less. It was the ancestral property of the Ashworth family, and on this particular evening, it served as the unofficial headquarters of the Conservative campaign, as it had served every Conservative campaign since 1887. The hall was a Georgian building of considerable pretension and moderate grace, its limestone facade scrubbed clean for the occasion, its east wing given over entirely to the campaign committee, its drawing room transformed into a waiting chamber for those who considered themselves too important for the public counting rooms, but too anxious to remain at home. The rooms smelled of coal smoke and bay rum, and the particular species of anxiety that only political evenings produce. Reginald Ashworth was the Conservative candidate, and he stood at the window of the first-floor study that had been his father's and his grandfather's before that, looking out at the torchlit procession that was making its way up the village high street, with the mechanical enthusiasm of people who have been told to appear spontaneous. He was 43 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of jaw that suggested either great resolution or great obstinacy depending on whether you wanted his vote. His hair was dark, with the first distinguished threads of grey at the temples, and he wore his evening clothes with the easy comfort of a man who has never had to think about what he wears. He was not, in this moment, thinking about his clothes. He was watching the procession with the fixed expression of a man performing the act of watching while his mind occupied itself entirely elsewhere. "They've turned out well," said a voice from the leather armchair by the fire. "Better than Tuesday's canvass suggested." The speaker was Lawrence Trent, Ashworth's campaign agent, a lean and angular man of 50, with the permanently cautious expression of someone who has managed political campaigns long enough to believe that everything pleasant precedes something catastrophic. He held a sheaf of polling returns that he consulted with the devotion of a prophet reading entrails. "Sefton's people have been busy in the Croft ward," Ashworth said, without turning from the window. "I saw their motor cars all afternoon. We've held Croft before on worse ground. We've held everything before." There was a quality to that statement. Not pride exactly, but something heavier, that made Trent glance up from his papers. Ashworth's reflection in the glass was difficult to read. Outside, the torchlight procession had acquired a band, which was rendering a patriotic air with more volume than precision. "Your wife is asking for you," Trent said. "She's been with the Beaumont woman in the morning room for the better part of an hour." Something moved across Ashworth's face. It was not much, a slight tightening around the eyes, a fractional shift of the jaw, but it was there, and it passed as quickly as it came. "I'll go down presently," he said. The morning room occupied the southeast corner of Ridgeway Hall's ground floor, and in it, arranged on opposite sides of a low table bearing a cold tea tray and an untouched plate of sandwiches, sat 2 women whose mutual courtesy was so elaborately maintained that it had long since passed from social grace into a form of combat. Eleanor Ashworth was 41, fair and still handsome in the precise, architectural way of women whose beauty has always been their least interesting quality. She was the daughter of a Northamptonshire baronet, and had brought to her marriage both an impeccable pedigree and a private income that had proved considerably more useful than her husband's inheritance during the lean years of the late 20s. She wore a slate blue evening gown and her mother's pearls, and the expression of a woman who has decided, many years ago, to find everything amusing rather than permit herself to find anything devastating. Across from her sat Vivienne Beaumont, Miss Beaumont. She was unmarried, a fact which the village had long since exhausted itself speculating about, was 34, dark, with the kind of vivid, asymmetrical beauty that painters prefer to the more conventional sort. She had come to Ashenford 18 months ago as private secretary to Alderman Hartley Beaumont, who was her uncle, and who had, 6 weeks ago, thrown his considerable civic weight behind the Conservative campaign, on the basis of a promise Ashworth had apparently made regarding the proposed new waterworks at Storefield. Whether that promise had been fulfilled, and what other promises had accompanied it, was a matter of considerable delicacy. Miss Beaumont served, officially, as the campaign's correspondence secretary. What she served unofficially was a question that Eleanor Ashworth had been asking herself for the better part of a year, with an answer that grew more definitive and less tolerable with each successive week. The counting should begin at 9, Eleanor said, with the precision of a woman who has memorized the evening schedule to avoid the necessity of conversation. "So I understand," said Vivienne Beaumont. Her voice was low, carefully modulated, with an occasional note of irony, of pain, that surfaced and submerged too quickly to be named. "Your husband will make a fine member, I think." "He has made a fine candidate," Eleanor replied. "Whether Parliament agrees remains to be seen." The third member of Ashenford's election night drama, who deserves our particular attention, was at this moment standing in the kitchen passage that connected the hall's service wing to the main corridor, engaged in a conversation that, had either participant understood its eventual significance, might have been conducted rather differently. Dr. Oliver Maitland was 56, the village physician, a widower, a fly fisherman, and a man whose long professional acquaintance with the intimate disasters of the human body had left him with both a deep compassion for individual suffering and a somewhat lowered estimate of collective human wisdom. He had been Reginald Ashworth's school friend, his physician, and, a status he valued above the other two, his honest critic in a world that had grown progressively reluctant to offer the candidate anything but enthusiasm. He was speaking with Agnes Parrott, the hall's housekeeper, a stout Nottinghamshire woman of the practical and unillusionable sort, whose family had served the Ashworths for 2 generations, and who therefore felt entitled to opinions about its members that she would never have permitted herself to express to anyone outside her own considerable confidence. "The captain was in the East Passage again," Agnes said, keeping her voice below the range of the kitchen's general noise. "Just before supper, going through the blue sitting room." "Captain Durrant?" "None other." Agnes's mouth compressed. He had no reason to be in that part of the house. The campaign rooms are on the west side. Maitland considered this. Captain Felix Durrant was Ashworth's younger cousin, or half-cousin to be precise, about a genealogy that the Ashworth family preferred imprecise, who had arrived at Ridgeway Hall 3 days before the election at the candidate's personal invitation. Durrant was 38, an ex-officer of the 7th Fusiliers, currently engaged in what he described as business interests in London, which description Maitland had always found distinguished more by its vagueness than its candour. He was darkly handsome in a slightly overworked way, excellent company at dinner, and possessed of the particular charm of a man who has learned that charm is more efficient than merit. "What would he want in the blue sitting room?" Maitland asked. Agnes looked at him with the expression of a woman who is choosing, on this particular occasion, not to express what she thinks. "The family safe is in the study adjoining," she said simply, and turned back to supervising the supper arrangements. The 4th floor of Ridgeway Hall's east wing contained, in addition to guest bedrooms and a lumber room of comprehensive disorder, the private apartment that had been assigned to Alderman Hartley Beaumont. The alderman was 67, broad, ruddy-faced, with white mutton chop whiskers of a flamboyance that suggested either magnificent self-confidence or a complete indifference to the opinions of his fellow men. He had made his fortune in Midlands manufacturing, had translated it into local political influence with the practiced ease of a man who understands that money and power are merely different denominations of the same currency, and had in the 6 weeks of the campaign made himself, in his own estimation, entirely indispensable to Ashworth's prospects. At 8:30 on this election night, Alderman Hartley Beaumont was found dead in his 4th-floor apartment. He was discovered by his niece Vivienne, who had gone up to bring him his customary pre-result whiskey and soda. The door was unlocked. The alderman was seated in his armchair, in a posture that initially suggested sleep. He had been known to doze in his chair during the evening, but the quality of that stillness was wrong in the particular way that the living instantly recognize and instantly resist recognizing. His face was darkened, congested. The whiskey glass that he apparently had been drinking before Vivienne's arrival lay on its side on the carpet, a small curved stain spreading from it like a shadow. Dr. Maitland was summoned. He examined the body with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who has long since learned that the body tells the truth when the living choose not to. He noted the congestion of the face. He noted the position of the fallen glass, and the smell, faint but distinct, beneath the whiskey, that rose from it when he bent close. He noted the small but unmistakable traces of vomiting that the alderman had apparently managed to conceal, or attempted to, in the final moments before unconsciousness overtook him. He straightened. He looked, for a long moment, at Vivienne Beaumont, who stood in the doorway with the composure of a woman who is holding herself together by a method that will not sustain indefinitely. "You touched nothing?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "I saw at once. I saw, quite." Maitland looked at the glass, at the alderman's discoloured face, at the small bottle of Beaumont's heart medication that sat on the side table, cardiac glycoside, prescribed by the alderman's London physician, to be taken in precise and undeviating dosage. "I think," he said very carefully, "that you should ask Mr. Ashworth to telephone the police." Vivienne stared at him. "Oliver," she said, "what are you saying?" "I am saying," Maitland replied, with the measured precision of a man delivering a verdict he has not yet confirmed, but can no longer responsibly withhold, "that your uncle did not die of a natural failure of the heart, however much we might wish he had. And I am saying that on an evening such as this, with this particular house full of people with particular interests, we would all be very foolish indeed to assume that the manner of his death was an accident." Below, in the market square, the band had stopped playing. Somewhere in the village, a church bell was striking 9. The counting of the votes was about to begin. Alderman Hartley Beaumont would not learn the result. Chapter 2. The Belgian arrives. The police arrived from Sturfield at 9:45, in the persons of Detective Inspector Hawkins of the County Constabulary, and his sergeant, a young man named Poole, who moved through the corridors of Ridgeway Hall with the particular reverence of someone who has never previously been required to investigate a crime in a house with a butler. Hawkins was a capable officer of the methodical variety, 38 years old, with a neat brown moustache and the expression of a man who would prefer the world to organize itself according to the schedule he had printed in his notebook. An election night murder was not on that schedule, and it showed. He had cordoned the alderman's apartment, had taken preliminary statements from Vivienne Beaumont and from Dr. Maitland, and had dispatched Sergeant Poole to ascertain whether any of the hall's other guests had left the premises since approximately 8 o'clock. He had done all of this with commendable efficiency, and with the growing, privately acknowledged suspicion that he was standing at the edge of something considerably more complex than his experience had prepared him for. It was Lawrence Trent, Ashworth's campaign agent, who made the telephone call. Not to the county superintendent, as Hawkins would have preferred, but to London, to a Whitehall exchange, to a number that connected, after 3 operators and 1 exasperated delay, with a small, immaculate flat in Whitehaven Mansions, where a man was at that moment eating a very late supper of tisane and the finest Gruyere biscuits he could obtain in wartime, and reading, with the composed attention of a man for whom mystery was both profession and pleasure, the collected letters of Madame de Sévigné. The call lasted 4 minutes. When it concluded, Hercule Poirot set down his book, finished his tisane at leisure, and telephoned his own number for a taxicab. He was in Ashenford by midnight. He arrived, as was his invariable custom, somewhat theatrically. The taxicab deposited him at the front door of Ridgeway Hall precisely as the market square clock struck 12, and he stood for a moment on the stone steps in the torchlit dark. For the election's illuminations had not been extinguished, though their festive character now seemed considerably altered, allowing the house to form itself to his impression before he permitted himself to form an impression of the house. He was not, it must be said, the figure that Ridgeway Hall's inhabitants expected. Those members of the household who had gathered, with the complicated instincts of the English in crisis, in the entrance hall to observe the expert's arrival, found themselves presented with a small Belgian gentleman of a certain age, impeccably dressed in a dark overcoat of continental cut, with a pearl-grey Homburg hat set at a precise angle that suggested both fashion and geometry, and beneath the hat a head of the egg-shaped variety that its owner was known to regard as the suitable housing for the finest reasoning apparatus in Europe. The famous moustaches were present and magnificent, curled at their extremities with a care that suggested they had been attended to, even at this late hour, and even in the face of urgent summons, which was entirely true. "Bien," said Poirot softly, looking up at the facade of Ridgeway Hall with the air of a connoisseur assessing an exhibit. The Georgian proportion, it is admirable, but the electrical illuminations, they have now a somewhat funeral character, none. He entered. Inspector Hawkins met him in the entrance hall, with the barely concealed mixture of relief and territorial anxiety that official investigators always displayed when Poirot appeared at their cases. They had worked together once before, at the Bracton Manor affair of 1930, and Hawkins retained from that experience both a considerable respect for Poirot's methods and a constitutional inability to enjoy them. "Good of you to come, M. Poirot," he said, with the formality of a man who means it but would prefer not to. "It is Trent who was good enough to telephone," Poirot replied pleasantly, handing his hat and coat to the hovering Bridges, the hall's butler, with the precision of a man who believes every garment deserves to be correctly received. "Now, you will show me, if you please, the apartment of the deceased. After, I will speak with the residents. But first, the room. Always, one must begin with what cannot be altered by human testimony." The alderman's apartment on the 4th floor had been preserved as Maitland had left it. Poirot entered, paused, and stood quite still in the centre of the room for a period that extended, to Inspector Hawkins's mounting impatience, to something over 3 minutes. In that 3 minutes, Poirot looked at the body of the deceased in its armchair, which had been photographed but not yet moved, the fallen whiskey glass and its stain, the side table with its bottle of heart medication, the ashtray, empty, and placed on the left side of the armchair, the window, closed, the second window, open approximately 3 inches, the position of the armchair relative to the door, the degree of lamplight in the room, and, finally, the small escritoire against the far wall, upon which lay a blotting pad, a pen, a capped inkwell, and a note-case in brown leather. He crossed to the escritoire. He did not open the note-case. He looked at the blotting pad, tilting his head to examine the impression in the manner of a man reading a palimpsest. He looked at the position of the inkwell. He looked at the pen. "The pen," he said aloud. "It has been used this evening, recently. The ink is not fully dry on the nib." "We noticed that," Hawkins said. "And yet," Poirot continued, gently, "there is no letter, no memorandum, no written item anywhere in this room. The blotting pad has been used, but the writing has been taken away. By whom, and where has it gone?" He turned. "The note-case. It has not been opened this evening." "How can you tell?" Poirot indicated a minuscule crack of dust along the note-case's clasp, visible only if one happened to be looking for the small evidence of things undisturbed. "Because those who search for something," he said thoughtfully, "rarely think to replace the dust afterwards." He moved to the side table and bent to examine the bottle of heart medication without touching it, reading its label with the careful attention of a man who wishes to retain its content precisely. "Digitalis preparation," he murmured. "Prescribed by Dr. Renwick of Harley Street. The dose, 45 drops, 3 times daily. The bottle, it has been recently opened." He looked at the fallen whiskey glass. "And the glass, tell me, Inspector, has the residue been analysed?" "The police surgeon from Stowfield is coming in the morning." "Très bien. But Dr. Maitland, he has already formed an opinion. It was not a question. He believes the alderman received an overdose of his own medication." "Ah." Poirot straightened, and in his eyes, those eyes that were sometimes described as green, sometimes as grey, always as unnervingly direct, there was a quality that was not exactly satisfaction, but was perhaps its more serious cousin. "Digitalis, you understand, is the most domestic of poisons. It is present in the medication of every second elderly heart patient in England. An overdose produces precisely the symptoms that Dr. Maitland described: the congestion, the cardiac collapse, the appearance of natural failure. Only someone who was specifically looking, who was already suspicious, would distinguish it from a simple cardiac event." He paused. "Someone like Dr. Maitland, who knew his patient, who knew what to look for, and who, crucially, knew what to smell for in that glass." He turned to face the room one final time, his gaze moving slowly across it as a conductor's eye moves across an orchestra before the first downbeat. "The murderer," Poirot said quietly, "understood medicine, or understood, at minimum, that 45 drops in a whiskey glass, dissolved, would leave a taste the old man would attribute to the whiskey itself." He touched his moustache, that precise, habitual gesture of a man organising his thoughts into their proper sequence. This was not an impulsive crime. This was planned, prepared, and executed by someone with specific knowledge and access, someone within this house tonight. He looked at Hawkins. "Now, mon ami, I will speak with the people. The library of Ridgeway Hall had been designated as the interview room, and Poirot conducted himself there with the air of an impresario inspecting his stage. He arranged his chair so that he faced the window, which meant that anyone seated across from him would have the lamplight fully in their face, while Poirot's own expression remained in the slight dusk of the room's indirect illumination. He asked for and received a small table, upon which he placed his notebook, which he would not open during the interviews, merely consult occasionally with an ambiguity that interviewees consistently found unnerving, and a cup of the hall's overbrewed tea, which he examined with the resigned expression of a man who has learned that English hospitality operates in inverse proportion to his actual preferences. He also asked, before anyone entered, for one specific piece of information. He wished to know which rooms in the house had a direct line of sight to the fourth-floor east window, the one that had been open 3 inches. Sergeant Poole consulted the floor plan. The answer was, the study on the first floor, currently occupied by Reginald Ashworth, and the first-floor corridor window, accessible from the main landing. Poirot nodded, as though this confirmed something he had already suspected, and asked that the interviews begin. His first impressions, as the suspects were brought to him one by one, in the library's inadequate lamp glow, accumulated with the quiet efficiency of evidence that knows it will eventually be needed. Reginald Ashworth came first. He was composed, extraordinarily composed, for a man whose principal financial backer had just died on his election night, and his composure had a quality that Poirot noted without yet knowing what to make of it. It was not the composed surface of grief controlled. It was something more complex, something in which relief might have been playing a quiet but audible note beneath the dominant chord of consternation. He expressed his shock appropriately, answered Hawkins' questions with the practiced directness of a politician who has learned that the best preparation for unwanted questions is to answer the questions you've been asked, and none of the ones you haven't. He met Poirot's eyes once, directly, and looked away. Lawrence Trent was efficient, analytical, concerned primarily, or so it appeared, with the political consequences of the evening's events. A man is dead, and Trent was thinking about the seat. Poirot found this revealing in ways that Trent had clearly not intended. Eleanor Ashworth arrived with the cool precision of a woman who has been expecting, for longer than this evening, that something in her household was going to collapse. Her grief, if it was grief, had the quality of confirmation rather than shock. And then Vivienne Beaumont entered the library. She had composed herself since the discovery. Poirot could see the effort of that composure, in the slight stiffness of her posture, in the careful way she held her hands, but her eyes were not composed. They were the eyes of a woman in whom several very powerful feelings were engaged in a contest, and Poirot watched them the way a naturalist watches a specimen that is behaving unexpectedly. She was, he decided, in the first moments of looking at her, a woman who was simultaneously grieving, afraid, and concealing something that was neither grief nor fear, but perhaps the thing that both of them were organized around. "Mademoiselle Beaumont," said Poirot gently. "Tell me about your uncle," she told him. And as she spoke, Poirot listened, not only to what she said, but to the precise locations where her voice, which was otherwise beautifully controlled, developed the microscopic tremor of a person navigating very carefully around something they have decided must not be said. Chapter 3. The Architecture of Secrets. The following morning arrived grey and damp, with a mist that flattened the village into its November temperament ahead of schedule, and settled over Ridgeway Hall with the comfortable persistence of a house guest who has not been told when he is expected to leave. The election result had come in at 2 in the morning. Ashworth had won the seat by 412 votes. The village's Conservative contingent had attempted a modest celebration, but the news of the alderman's death had filtered through by then, and the jubilation had the quality of music played in a room where something is wrong, never quite achieving its intended pitch. Poirot had slept for 4 hours, and risen to find that his faculties had reached, in the night's quiet, several provisional conclusions that required the day's interviews to either confirm or dissolve. He breakfasted on what the hall's kitchen offered: an egg that had been boiled perhaps 30 seconds beyond his preference, toast that had grown cold in transit, butter of quality, and organized, during this performance, the architecture of what he knew, and the architecture of what remained to be known. There were 5 people in Ridgeway Hall on the night of Hercule Beaumont's death, who possessed, in varying combinations, the elements of motive, access, and knowledge that the crime required. The first was Reginald Ashworth. The motive was financial, or more precisely, it was the kind of financial motive that had passed beyond the merely monetary into the existential. Trent had mentioned, in a moment of unguarded candor during their brief exchange the night before, that the Beaumont manufacturing interests had been sustaining Ashworth's campaign not merely with the alderman's active support, but with direct financial contributions whose continuance into Ashworth's parliamentary career had been conditional upon assurances Ashworth had apparently given, and which Poirot gathered were now, following the alderman's death, subject to a legal question that the dead man's estate would need time to resolve. It was possible to read that motive as relief, the death removing a creditor who had also become a controller. But there was something else, something involving the east window and the study, that Poirot was not yet ready to close. The second was Lawrence Trent. He was a man who managed ambitions not his own, which is a condition that breeds its own particular species of resentment. Trent had been Ashworth's agent for 11 years. In that time, Ashworth had twice passed over Trent for positions that would have elevated the agent's own prospects, and Trent had swallowed each occasion with a loyalty that Poirot suspected had left a residue of bitterness proportional to its suppression. Whether Trent's motive connected to Beaumont personally, Poirot had not yet determined, but the man's principal concern on the night of a murder had been the political consequences, and Poirot's experience of human nature told him that a man who is genuinely shocked does not immediately begin calculating. The third was Captain Felix Durrant. What Agnes Parrott had reported, the captain in the East Passage, the proximity to the family safe, remained unexplained, and Durrant himself had been the most evasive of Poirot's interviewees, exhibiting the particular fluency of a man who has practiced the art of the uninformative answer sufficiently to perform it automatically. He was a man with debts. That much was visible in the quality of his otherwise excellent clothes, in the slight strain beneath the social smoothness, and debts of a certain character in 1932 had a way of creating necessities that would otherwise never arise. The fourth was Dr. Oliver Maitland. He had discovered the crime, or rather, he had identified it as a crime, which was not quite the same thing. He had known the alderman's medical condition. He had access to, and understood, the medication that had almost certainly killed him. He was in the house legitimately, moved through it with familiar ease, and had been the first to both examine the body and preserve the evidence. Poirot did not, as a general rule, automatically suspect the man who raised the alarm, but neither did he exclude him without cause. The fifth was Vivienne Beaumont. She was, Poirot had concluded in the library's lamplight, the most interesting figure in this house. She was the deceased's niece, and stood to inherit a portion of his estate. She was, apparently, intimately connected with the candidate whose campaign her uncle had been financing. She had discovered the body. She had been alone with her uncle, by her own account, for the better part of the morning, before the evening's events had begun. But what interested Poirot most was not any of these material facts. What interested him was the note he had observed when he asked Vivienne, quite casually and as though it were the least important question of the evening, whether her uncle had received any visitors that afternoon. She had said, only the usual ones. And in the moment between his question and her answer, her eyes had moved, briefly, involuntarily, to the left and slightly upward. Not the movement of a person recalling a fact, the movement of a person deciding what version of a fact to present. It was a small thing. But Poirot's career had been built on the small things that other investigators found beneath their notice. He now arranged for the morning's conversations with the care of a chess player who knows which pieces need to be moved before the endgame, and in what order. He began with Captain Durrant, in the morning room, alone. Durrant presented himself with the easy confidence that Poirot recognized as armor. He was bright-eyed, crisp in manner, prepared. He had, Poirot gathered, rehearsed the night. You were in the East Passage at approximately 7:30, Poirot said, as though this were a pleasantry rather than an observation. Agnes Parrott is quite specific about the time. Something moved in Durrant's eyes, quickly controlled. I was looking for the cloakroom. I'm afraid I misremembered its location. Ah, yes. And the blue sitting room. Also en route to the cloakroom? A pause. Fractional, but measurable. I may have looked in to check whether it was the right room. Naturally. Poirot permitted a silence to develop, then said, You are in some financial difficulty, Captain Durrant. I do not say this to embarrass you. I say it because it is relevant. You have debts, of the kind that one does not discuss openly, but which are present in certain expressions and certain behaviors for those who know where to look. He folded his hands on the table. The safe in the study adjoining the blue sitting room. It contains, I am informed, the deeds to a property that was left to your mother, and which has been in dispute between yourself and your cousin since her death. Reginald Ashworth holds the relevant documents. He tilted his head. You wished to resolve that matter on a night when the house was full of people and attention was focused elsewhere. Am I mistaken? Durrant looked at him for a long moment. Then, with the particular relief of a man who has been carrying a weight for longer than is sustainable, he said, I didn't touch anything. I looked, that's all. I knew where Reginald kept the documents. He showed me once, years ago. I thought perhaps, with everything going on, I could look at them, understand whether I had any grounds at all. He paused. I didn't go in, but you intended to. I considered it. Durrant's jaw tightened. I did not kill the alderman. I didn't even know the man particularly. Ah, said Poirot softly. But you knew something about him, perhaps. Another pause, longer than the last. I knew, Durrant said at last, that he and Reginald had quarrelled. Last week. Badly. About what? I don't know precisely. I heard raised voices from the study when I was passing in the corridor. The old man was furious. I could hear that clearly enough. Something about promises made and promises broken. Something about consequences. He looked at Poirot steadily. I didn't think much of it at the time. Men quarrel before elections. It seemed the sort of thing that blows over. Yes, Poirot murmured. The sort of thing that blows over. Or, he added, very gently, the sort of thing that does not. He spoke next with Eleanor Ashworth. She came into the morning room with the composure that he had noted the night before, and she sat across from him with the air of a woman who is prepared for this conversation, has thought about what she will and will not say, and is secure in the preparation. This, Poirot thought, was in itself informative. An innocent person, in his experience, rarely prepares their testimony with such precision. He asked her about the evening. She gave him a clear, chronological account. She had been in the drawing-room until approximately 8. She had spoken with several committee members. She had been with Vivienne Beaumont in the morning-room from approximately 8:15 until Vivienne had gone upstairs to bring her uncle his whiskey, which would have been approximately 8:30. You and Miss Beaumont? You were close? Poirot asked. Eleanor looked at him with the expression of a woman translating one question into its real meaning. We work well together, she said carefully. Ah. And your husband and Miss Beaumont? They also work well together? A silence. Eleanor's hands, folded in her lap, did not move. Her face did not move. She was, Poirot thought, a woman of quite extraordinary self-command. My husband is a politician, she said at last. Politicians require numerous working relationships, précisément. And the alderman? He was aware of the particular nature of these working relationships. Something shifted, very slightly, in Eleanor's composure. Not much, but Poirot was watching for it. I believe, she said, with a care that suggested each word was being weighed before placement, that Hercule Beaumont was a man who observed a great deal and understood a great deal. He was also a man who considered knowledge, of any kind, to be a useful commodity. You mean, Poirot said gently, that he was blackmailing someone. The word fell into the room with the particular weight of words that everyone has been thinking and no one has said. Eleanor Ashworth looked at Poirot for a long moment. Then she said, I mean that he understood leverage. I mean that when he gave support, he expected the support to be reciprocal, in all respects. She left the room with the dignity of a woman who has said both more and less than she intended, and is calculating, as she goes, which of the two is more dangerous. Dr. Maitland was the last of the morning's significant conversations. He came in, sat down, and looked at Poirot with the direct, unsentimental gaze of a man who has spent 40 years looking at things as they are, rather than as he might prefer them to be. You identified the poisoning, Poirot said. I am curious to understand what exactly prompted you to look beyond the natural cause. Maitland was quiet for a moment. The smell, he said. Digitalis preparation in sufficient quantity has a distinctive smell. Faintly sweet, almost floral. Not unpleasant, but identifiable once you know it. The whiskey masked it almost completely. Almost. He paused. I have been Hercule Beaumont's physician for... No, I had not been his physician. His physician was a man in London. I knew him socially. I knew, from conversations, his medical condition. I knew the medication. You knew the medication well enough, Poirot said, to know precisely how much would be required to produce a fatal outcome in a man of his age and cardiac condition. Maitland looked at him without expression. Any competent physician with access to a pharmacopoeia would know that. Of course. Poirot made a small note in his notebook, that was, in fact, not a note at all but a habitual gesture. You were close to Ashworth, a long friendship, and yet you have spent this morning, I think, asking yourself whether your friend is guilty of a thing. Maitland said nothing. Which was, Poirot reflected, its own kind of answer. Tell me, mon ami. The quarrel between Ashworth and the alderman. You knew of it. A very brief stillness. I knew there was tension, and the nature of that tension. Maitland looked at the window. He looked back at Poirot. Then, with the decision of a man who has been carrying something in solitude for long enough, the alderman knew about Reginald and Miss Beaumont. He had known for months. He used it. He was using it, not for money precisely. For assurances, political assurances, regarding the waterworks contract, the Storefield development. He had Reginald, obligated, and Miss Beaumont. She didn't know her uncle was using the affair as leverage. Or rather, Maitland stopped, or rather, Poirot completed quietly. She had only very recently discovered it, perhaps within the last day or two. Perhaps that is what she learned, and that is what she will not tell us. Maitland looked at him with something that, in a less disciplined man, might have been admiration. You're very quick. I am paid to be quick, said Poirot. It is when I am slow that I become interesting. He sat alone in the morning room after Maitland had gone, with his cold tea and his notebook, and added 3 things to the architecture already in his mind. The alderman had quarrelled violently with Ashworth. The alderman had been blackmailing Ashworth. Leverage, using knowledge of the affair with Vivienne. Vivienne had recently discovered that her uncle was using her relationship as a tool. 3 facts, each of which was sufficient, alone, to provide motive. Collectively, they comprised a structure of human damage that radiated outward from the dead man in the armchair, like the spokes of a broken wheel. Poirot closed his notebook, stood, and looked out at the grey October garden. Eh bien, he said softly, to no one. And now the interesting question. Not who had the motive. They all had the motive. But who had the knowledge, and the access, and the nerve? Chapter 4. What was not there? The afternoon brought Poirot back to the alderman's room, this time alone. Inspector Hawkins had received the police surgeon's preliminary report, which confirmed what Maitland had suspected. Digitalis poisoning. Dose consistent with at least 5 to 6 times the prescribed quantity dissolved in whiskey. The timing placed death between 7:30 and 8:30, narrowing the window considerably. The alderman had received the fatal dose no earlier than 7:15 and no later than 8, before Vivienne arrived with the evening whiskey at 8:30, which meant the glass of whiskey on the side table had already been poured and doctored before Vivienne came upstairs. But by whom? And when? Poirot moved through the apartment, with the patience of a man who believes that rooms preserve, in their objects and their silences, a residue of what has happened in them, if only one knows how to read the text. He examined, methodically and without visible urgency, the following: the escritoire and its blotting pad, the 2 windows, their locks, their positions, the bookshelf, particularly the 4 volumes whose spines showed the slight displacement of recent handling, the ashtray, the waste-paper basket, which had been emptied but whose bottom retained the dusty imprint of a crumpled paper ball, the side table with its whiskey decanter and its medication bottle, the armchair and its immediate environs. And then he stood in the centre of the room and thought about what was not there. The letter. Someone had written something at the escritoire and removed it. The nib was inked, the pad was blotted. A piece of correspondence had been composed in this room on this evening, and had subsequently disappeared. The second glass. The decanter on the side table had been used. Its level was marginally lower than a fresh bottle. The alderman's glass had fallen, but the glass had been poured by someone. And if it had been poured by someone other than the alderman, there was the question of what had happened to the person who poured it. Had they drunk with him? If so, why was there only 1 glass? The medication bottle cap. The bottle of digitallato racine sat on the side table. It was closed, but closed carefully, with the kind of precision that suggested it had been opened, used, and reclosed deliberately, not the careless replacing that a man performing his habitual evening routine would produce. And lastly, the alderman's personal correspondence file, which Agnes Parrott confirmed was kept on the lower shelf of the escritoire, and which was present, but which, when Poirot carefully examined it without touching the papers within, showed the particular disarrangement of a file that had been gone through in haste and had been imperfectly restored. Someone had searched the alderman's papers. Poirot stood at the escritoire and thought about the timeline with the focused attention of a man assembling a mechanism. If the poisoning occurred between 7:15 and 8, the murderer had entered this room during a period when the hall's ground floor was increasingly occupied with election night activity and the upper floors were, by contrast, relatively empty. The servants were in the kitchens, the committee members were in the campaign rooms, the principal guests were in the drawing room, the morning room, and the study. The fourth floor was, during this window, accessible to anyone who chose to climb the east staircase, the servants' stair, which connected directly to the east wing and would not be observable from the main entrance hall. Anyone in this house could have made that climb unobserved, provided they were not missed for 15 to 20 minutes. He went back to the blotting pad. He had looked at it the night before. Now he looked again, tilting it toward the grey afternoon light from the window, adjusting the angle with the minute precision of a man reading something very small. Blotting pad impressions are a well-established resource, and he had brought with him a small mirror for exactly this purpose. He held the mirror over the pad, found the most recently blotted section, and read. Most of the impression was illegible, too faint, too overlapping with previous blottings, but 3 phrases emerged with sufficient clarity to read. In the reversed mirror image, "Know what you have done, will not be silent after. Believe me when I say," the handwriting was the alderman's. Poirot had seen the man's signature on the campaign correspondence, and the formation of the letters was consistent. The man had been writing a letter, a threatening letter, or a letter that contained a threat, on the evening of his death. The letter was gone, which meant that whoever had come to this room had come, at least partly, to find it, or to deliver a response to it. Poirot placed the blotting pad back precisely as he had found it, straightened, and stood looking at the window. The open one, the 3-inch gap. He went to the window and looked out. Below, 40 feet down, was the stone terrace of the east wing, running along the base of the building. To the left, the terrace steps descended to the kitchen garden. The window below, that of the east corridor on the 3rd floor, was, from this angle, visible, but so was something else. Poirot leaned slightly further out and looked across the narrow angle to the face of the adjacent east wing. The iron fire escape bracket, bolted to the building's exterior at 3rd floor level, was still in place. The fire escape itself had been removed at some point in the past decade, but the bracket remained, and on the bracket, just visible in the grey afternoon light, there was a small scrap of dark wool, a thread, frayed at both ends, dark navy blue. Poirot stood looking at it for a moment. Then he went downstairs. He found Lawrence Trent in the campaign room, mechanically collating returns that no longer required collating, in the manner of a man who needs his hands occupied. "Monsieur Trent," Poirot said pleasantly, settling himself into an adjacent chair without invitation. "You are a man who observes things with precision. It is your profession, non? The management of detail, that's one way of putting it." Trent's eyes were on the papers. "Then you will perhaps have observed that yesterday evening, at approximately 7:40, there was a light burning in the alderman's window. The east window, the one that opens." A brief pause. "I don't recall paying attention to the windows." "No? But you passed the east corridor on your way to the campaign room. Agnes Parrott confirms the routing. The east window of the alderman's apartment would have been directly within your line of sight." Trent looked up. His eyes were careful. "I may have noticed a light, and perhaps you noticed. Someone at the window? Or approaching it?" "No." The answer came slightly too quickly and slightly too flatly, which are the two qualities an answer acquires when it is true in its literal content, but false in its implications. "Ah," said Poirot. He stood, thanked Trent for his time, and departed, leaving behind him the mild and unspecified sense that something had been confirmed. In the corridor, he met Vivienne Beaumont, apparently by accident, apparently on her way to the garden. "Mademoiselle," he said, falling into step beside her with the unhurried ease of a man who has no particular destination. "I wish to ask you something that may seem impertinent, but you will understand, I hope, that impertinence in the service of truth is a virtue rather than a failing." She looked at him sidelong. In the afternoon light, she looked exhausted, not the exhaustion of grief, but of sustained vigilance. "Your uncle," Poirot said gently. "He wrote a letter yesterday evening, before he died. That letter is now missing. Do you know to whom it was addressed?" A silence. "I think you do know," Poirot continued, still in the same gentle tone. "I think that you had a conversation with your uncle, perhaps yesterday morning, in which certain things became clear to you, things about his relationship with Mr. Ashworth, about the nature of the arrangement between them." And I think that what you learnt in that conversation caused you considerable distress. Vivienne's footsteps had slowed. They were in the garden now, at the edge of the box hedgerow, the autumn roses in their final deflated hour around them. He told me, she said. Her voice was very quiet. He was quite unashamed about it. He said it was a business arrangement, that Reginald owed him certain guarantees regarding the Storefield contract, and that if the guarantees were not honoured now that the election was won, he would— She stopped. She pressed her lips together. He would inform Eleanor Ashworth of what he knew, and if necessary, the newspapers. Blackmail, Poirot said, with a matter-of-factness that was its own form of compassion. Business, Vivienne said bitterly. He called it business, and the letter he was writing that evening. You believe it was addressed to Ashworth? I believe, Vivienne said, that my uncle had decided, last night, that the election was won and the time for patience was over. That he was going to demand, in writing, the specific commitments he wanted. She looked at Poirot, and I believe that Reginald received that letter. I think my uncle sent it down with one of the staff. I spoke to the scullery girl Mary this morning. She said the alderman rang for her at 6:30 and gave her a note to deliver, and she delivered it to Mr. Ashworth personally, in the study. Poirot was quiet for a moment. Then he said, And this knowledge, what did you intend to do with it? Vivienne looked at him with the expression of a woman who has been asking herself the same question. I don't know, she said. I had not decided. I was going to speak to Reginald, after the result. I thought— She stopped. She looked at the deflated roses. I thought a great many things that now seem extraordinary to have thought. Poirot nodded slowly. One final question, mademoiselle. When you went upstairs to bring your uncle his whiskey, the whiskey that you carried from the drawing-room decanter— I didn't bring him whiskey, she said. Poirot looked at her. I went upstairs to speak with him, not to bring him anything. The whiskey was already there. He had a decanter in his room. You did not carry a whiskey glass upstairs? No. Poirot stood very still for a moment. Then he said, quietly, Eh bien? This changes things, mademoiselle. This changes them considerably. Chapter 5. The Letters That Burned. The evening of the second day brought a development that Poirot had been both expecting and dreading, in the way that a chess player both expects and dreads the opponent's move that confirms the complexity of the game. It began with Agnes Parrott. She came to him after supper, in the library, with the careful composure of a woman who has made a decision and intends to execute it before her nerve fails her. She sat down without being asked, folded her hands on the table and said, There is something I ought to have told you yesterday. I am telling you now because I think it is the right thing to do, and because I am not certain that it is safe to remain silent. Poirot gave her his full, quiet attention. On the day of the election, in the morning, at about 11, I was in the east corridor on the 4th floor, changing the linens in the guest rooms. The alderman's apartment door was not fully closed. She paused. I could hear voices inside, the alderman and a woman. You recognized the woman's voice? I recognized it. It was Mrs. Ashworth, Eleanor. Poirot did not move. You are certain? I have known that voice for 12 years. And what were they saying? Agnes looked at her hands. I could not hear clearly. The door was not open enough for that. I heard the alderman, loudly. He was angry, or excited. He was speaking rapidly. I heard him say the whole of it, everything I have, and I heard Mrs. Ashworth say, quite calmly, You are a foolish old man. And then I heard her say something I could not make out, and the alderman said, You would not dare, and then I moved away. I did not want to be seen listening. I am telling you now because— Agnes paused, because that evening, when everything happened, I kept thinking about it, about her voice, about how calm she was. After Agnes had gone, Poirot sat with this new piece of the architecture for a long time. Eleanor Ashworth had been in the alderman's apartment on the morning of the murder, engaged in a confrontation that Agnes had witnessed. Eleanor had told Poirot she was unaware of the alderman's blackmailing activities, but if she had confronted him, if she had been there, had heard it from the man himself, then her ignorance was constructed, not genuine. The question was, constructed to protect herself, or to protect someone else. He asked to see Eleanor that evening. She came to the library with the same self-command that characterized all her appearances, but Poirot thought, looking at her with the attention he gave to people who were managing the performance of their own composure, that the command was costing more tonight than it had the night before. You visited Alderman Beaumont on the morning of the election, Poirot said, without preamble. A pause. Not long, but precisely the length of a pause in which a decision is being made. "Yes," she said, "you did not mention this." "No, you wish, perhaps, to tell me about it now?" Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had lost its careful social texture and become something plainer and more direct. "I went to tell him to stop." "Stop what, precisely?" "Stop using Vivienne. He had gone to her the night before, told her everything about the arrangement, deliberately, I believe, to provoke the confrontation between her and Reginald that he thought would give him more leverage. He was—" She stopped. When she resumed, her voice was under strict control. "He was a man who understood that the most efficient tool of pressure is not money or threat, but personal destruction. He had decided to weaponize Vivienne's feelings for Reginald, and Reginald's dependency on him, and another pause, "and my situation." "Your situation," Poirot repeated. "I knew about the affair. I had known for months. I had accommodated myself to it, in the manner that women of my position have always found it necessary to accommodate themselves to things that are not acceptable." Her voice was utterly steady. "The alderman knew that I knew. He used that knowledge too. He told me, that morning, that if Reginald did not produce the signed contract for Storefield by Christmas, he would publish a letter that contained evidence of the affair, in a manner that would destroy Reginald politically and me personally." "And what did you say to him?" "I said precisely what I said to you that afternoon, Monsieur Poirot. I told him he was a foolish old man, and then I told him that if he published one word, I would see to it that his business associates in Birmingham, certain associations which involved considerable financial irregularity, were made known to the appropriate authorities." She met Poirot's eyes. "I had documentation. I had been gathering it for 2 months, since I first understood what kind of man he was." "He said, you would not dare," Poirot recalled. Eleanor's expression did not change. "He underestimated me," she said simply. "And after that conversation, what happened? He became very quiet, and then he told me to leave, and I left." She paused. "He was alive when I left that room, Monsieur Poirot, and I did not go back." Poirot looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said slowly. "No, I do not think you did. But you think someone else did." "I think," Poirot said, "that your visit to the alderman that morning, and the manner in which it concluded, may have set in motion something that the person you are protecting has not yet told you about." Eleanor Ashworth went very still. "The person you are protecting," Poirot continued, very quietly, "has been in your thoughts throughout our conversations, though you have been careful to keep them from your words. You have answered every question about yourself with complete honesty, but when the questions approach this other person, there is a different quality of silence." He tilted his head. "You did not kill Hartley Beaumont, Madame Ashworth, but you believe you know who did." A silence extended between them, long, winter grey, full of the weight of things said and things not said. "I don't know," Eleanor said at last. "I suspect, but I do not know." "And whom do you suspect?" But Eleanor Ashworth had made her decision, and it held. She looked at Poirot with eyes that were clear and very sad and entirely closed. "I think," she said, "that you will have to find that out for yourself." Poirot walked in the kitchen garden that evening until the cold drove him back inside. He walked because he thought better in motion, and because what he was now assembling in his mind required the kind of careful movement that walking facilitates. He had 5 people. He had 5 motives. He had a murder that had been committed with surgical precision and prior planning. He had a letter that had disappeared. He had a confession, Eleanor's confrontation, that demonstrated both the victim's villainy and the suspect's steel. And he had one small fact that he had not yet shared with Inspector Hawkins, that had come to him in the course of the afternoon's consideration, and that he needed, before he moved, to verify. He went to find Agnes Parrott, the scullery girl, he said. "Mary, who delivered the alderman's letter to Ashworth at 6:30. "Yes, sir." "After she delivered the letter to Mr. Ashworth, what did she do?" "Did she return immediately to the kitchen?" Agnes thought. She would have come back the back way, through the east passage. And would she have passed anyone? In the passage or on the east stair? Agnes looked at him carefully. She might have. I could ask her. Poirot considered. "Please ask her whether, on her return through the east passage at approximately 6:30, she saw anyone coming down from the upper floor." Agnes returned 20 minutes later. "She says," Agnes reported, "that she met Captain Durrant on the east stair, coming down from the upper floors. He spoke to her, asked her some question about the evening arrangements, and she went past him to the kitchen. Poirot thanked her. He stood for a moment in the service corridor, thinking. Durrant had been on the east stair at 6:30. The alderman's apartment was on the 4th floor of the east wing. The fatal dose had been administered between 7:15 and 8. But wait, Poirot turned and went back to Agnes. One more question. Was it possible for someone to have entered the alderman's apartment, not through the main apartment door, but through the connecting door from the adjacent guest room? Agnes looked at him with the startled expression of someone who has just remembered a thing they did not know they had forgotten. The connecting door, the old one, between the alderman's sitting room and the east guest room. It was never locked. It's one of the old ones. The lock doesn't work. Everyone who knows the house knows it. And who knows the house? Agnes met his eyes. The family, she said. And anyone who stayed here more than once. Poirot stood very still in the service corridor for a long moment. The cold from the garden had come in with him on his clothes, and the flagstones beneath his feet held their own November chill. Two things were now clear that had not been clear before, and with their clarity, the entire architecture of the crime rearranged itself, and what had been a structure of several possible explanations became, with the precision that Poirot's mind applied to such moments, a single, terrible, and coherent whole. Chapter 6. The Little Grey Cells. Poirot did not sleep on the second night. He sat in the library until 3 in the morning, with his cold tea and his notebook, performing the interior operation that he thought of, with equal measures of humility and pride, as the only reliable technology of investigation, the complete, unsparing use of the little grey cells. He reviewed everything from the beginning, not as a sequence of discoveries, but as a complete simultaneous structure, the way a musical conductor hears all voices of a score at once. The first layer, the crime itself. Hartley Beaumont had been killed with a digitalis overdose dissolved in his evening whiskey, in his locked, or rather unlocked from within apartment on the 4th floor of the east wing, between 7:15 and 8 on the evening of October 14th. The second layer, the motive. Beaumont had been a blackmailer, systematic and businesslike. He had used knowledge of Ashworth's affair with Vivienne against the candidate's political viability. He had threatened Eleanor with personal exposure. He had, to judge from the fragments on the blotting pad, been in the process of crystallizing these threats into written demands on the very evening of his death. The third layer, access and knowledge. The murderer had used the alderman's own digitalis preparation. They had entered the apartment, either through the main door during the window of 7:15 to 8, or through the connecting guest room door, which removed the constraint entirely. They had doctored the whiskey that the alderman habitually poured for himself in the evening, which meant they knew the habit. They had found and taken the threatening letter. They had searched the correspondence file. Fourth layer. The evidence of absence. No second glass. No sign of struggle. The medication bottle reclosed with precision. The connecting door route explaining the absence of corridor observation. Fifth layer. The crucial reversal. Vivienne had not brought a whiskey glass upstairs. The alderman's whiskey had been already in the room. His personal decanter, not served from the drawing room. This destroyed the hypothesis that the poison had been introduced during the carrying of the glass from below, and confirmed that it had been introduced in the room itself, by someone with access to the room. Sixth layer, the timing chain. Mary delivers the alderman's letter to Ashworth at 6:30. Durrant seen on the east stair by Mary at approximately 6:30. Coming down from the upper floors. The fatal dose administered between 7:15 and 8. Vivienne discovers the body at 8:30. Poirot put down his pen. The problem of Captain Durrant on the east stair at 6:30 had initially suggested Durrant as a candidate for the act, but 6:30 was too early for the dose, which required at least 45 minutes to produce the cardiac collapse Maitland had described. If Durrant had been on that stair at 6:30, he was almost certainly engaged in his original project, examining the safe documents, and not in poisoning the alderman, whose medication would not have been effective for another 45 minutes at minimum, leaving the earlier window of 6:30 inadequate. Unless, Poirot sat forward, unless the dose had been introduced not into the whiskey glass itself, but into the whiskey decanter. A larger dilution, but a sufficient quantity dissolved into the alderman's private decanter, would produce the same eventual effect, albeit requiring the alderman to pour and drink from it himself. The decanter was in the room all day. It could have been accessed through the connecting door at any point during the afternoon, when the apartment was unoccupied. Poirot thought about the displacement of the books on the shelf. 4 volumes, recently handled. The bookshelf was opposite the escritoire. If you entered through the connecting door, which opened near the bookshelf, and your purpose was the escritoire and the correspondence file, you would pass the bookshelf. If you had also visited the side table to deal with the decanter, you would have needed to pass close by, but the books, 4 of them, slightly displaced. Not the casual displacement of someone reaching past to something further back, the deliberate displacement of someone who has used the bookshelf as support, as leverage, as the thing one grips when one is performing an action that requires steadiness because one's hands are shaking. Poirot sat very still, hands shaking. Not with criminality. The act of introducing poison into a decanter, while requiring nerve, is a physical action that most steady-handed adults could perform with confidence. Hands shake, in Poirot's experience, when a person is doing something against their deepest nature, when a person has decided, after a long struggle, on a course of action that their better self is still resisting. He thought about Eleanor Ashworth's eyes, about her voice saying, "I don't know, I suspect," about the specific quality of protectiveness that she had been performing throughout these 2 days. Not the protectiveness of conspiracy, of a woman who knew what had been done and was concealing it. The protectiveness of a woman who had looked at the evidence and drawn a conclusion that she loved too much to confirm. He thought about Oliver Maitland. He thought about Maitland's medical knowledge, his access, his long friendship with Ashworth, his care for Eleanor. He thought about Maitland's statement, "He knew what to smell for." He thought about a physician who has spent a career watching the human cost of situations like this one, a man's weakness, a woman's silent endurance, a predator disguised as a benefactor, and who had, perhaps, reached a point at which the professional code and the human code were no longer reconcilable. He thought about Maitland's hands during their interview. Steady, absolutely steady. The hands of a man who has already made his peace, and he thought about the blue wool thread on the fire escape bracket, and about the fact that Maitland had worn, on the evening of the murder, a dark navy overcoat. Poirot closed his notebook. He understood the crime now. He understood who had done it and how and why. What remained was the question that in his long career had never grown simple, the question of what to do with the truth. He sat with it until the library's last coal had exhausted itself, and the grey pre-dawn light began to describe the window's shape against the darkness. Then he made his decision. It was not the decision he would have made 20 years ago, but 20 years of the little grey cells, and 20 years of watching justice serve itself and injustice hide behind the law, had produced in Hercule Poirot a subtlety about such decisions that he was not entirely comfortable with and could not in the end argue against. He would gather them all. He would present the truth as he had found it, and then he would let the truth do what truths do when they are fully formed and precisely stated in a room where everyone must hear them. Chapter 7. The Gathering. The yellow drawing room of Ridgeway Hall had served many functions in its long history. Receptions, negotiations, family confrontations, at least one occasion of documented weeping by a prime minister, and it now prepared to serve another. The fire had been built up at Poirot's request, the chairs arranged in the arc that he preferred for these gatherings, the morning light admitted through the tall windows that gave onto the terrace. At 10 o'clock on the morning of the 16th, Poirot assembled them all. They entered with the careful avoidance of each other's eyes, that people who share a secret, even people who share separate and individual secrets, instinctively adopt in proximity. Reginald Ashworth came first, and sat with the rigid composure of a man who has won an election and is not certain he will be permitted to enjoy the victory. Eleanor Ashworth sat at a slight distance from her husband, not coldly, not dramatically, but with the measured distance of a woman who has decided that for the present, geography is her best available honesty. Lawrence Trent occupied a chair near the door, with the alert weariness of a man who has spent his career watching for exits. Captain Derrant, looking somewhat diminished from his election night sleekness, sat between the 2 windows with his ankles crossed and his hands loose in his lap, an assumed casualness that Poirot found more revealing than the tension it was designed to conceal. Dr. Oliver Maitland took his place beside the fireplace, standing rather than sitting, as a man will sometimes stand when he has decided to receive what is coming to him on his feet. Vivienne Beaumont came last. She sat nearest to Poirot, which was either accident or the instinct of a woman who has decided that proximity to the truth is preferable to the alternative. Inspector Hawkins stood near the door. Sergeant Poole was in the corridor. Poirot stood at the room's centre. He was immaculate, more immaculate than usual, which was a feat of some distinction, and he held his hands clasped before him, with the tranquil precision of a man who is about to say several things that will permanently alter the lives of everyone in the room. and who has made his peace with that responsibility. I thank you all for coming, he said. You will understand that it is necessary that I speak with complete frankness, and that what I say will be not entirely comfortable for everyone present. I ask only that you will permit me to reach the conclusion before you, shall we say, contest the journey. He began with a methodical and almost clinical account of the crime's structure. He described the poisoning, the method, the timing, the medical mechanism. He described the 2 routes of access to the apartment. He described the correspondence search, the letter on the blotting pad, the displaced books, the thread of navy wool on the fire escape bracket. He watched their faces as he spoke. Ashworth's jaw was rigid. Eleanor's expression had not changed. Trent was calculating something behind his eyes. Durrant's studied ease had slipped enough to show the anxiety beneath. Maitland stood with the stillness of a man listening to an account he already knows. Let us address first, Poirot said, the persons who have secrets that are relevant but do not constitute the crime. He turned to Durrant. Captain Durrant was on the east stair at 6:30 on the evening of the murder. He was there because he intended to access the safe in the adjacent study, a matter of long-standing property dispute with his cousin. He did not enter the alderman's apartment. He did not commit this murder. His guilt on this evening is limited to the intent, which is guilt of a kind, but not the kind we are here to address. He paused. Are you able to confirm this, Captain Durrant? Durrant looked at him steadily. Yes, he said. Très bien. I suggest that you and your cousin find a solicitor rather than a safe as the method for resolving your dispute. He moved on. Mr. Trent, you saw, from the east corridor, something that evening which you have declined to share. You saw, at approximately 7:30, I believe, a figure on or near the exterior of the east wing, in the vicinity of the fire escape bracket. You have not said this because you were not certain what you had seen, and because what you suspected would be difficult. Trent said nothing, but his hands, which had been still on his notebook, shifted. You do not need to confirm it, Poirot said. I have confirmed it by other means, but your silence has cost this investigation 36 hours, and I mention it not to accuse you, but because there is a lesson here about the price of political calculation, and you are, after all, a man of politics. He turned to Ashworth. Mr. Ashworth, you received a letter from Alderman Beaumont at 6:30. That letter contained demands, specific, written, legally vulnerable demands, regarding the Sturfield contract, accompanied by an explicit threat to expose your personal life if those demands were not met. You were angry. You had been in a position of subjugation to this man for 6 weeks, and the election was won, and the leverage was not releasing. The letter changed nothing, it confirmed everything. Poirot held his gaze. You thought about what you might do, and then you did nothing, because you are not, despite everything, a man who kills. You are a man who accommodates and maneuvers and waits, and because you knew, or suspected, that someone who cared for you was already taking action. Ashworth's face had gone very still. You did not go to the alderman's apartment. You remained in the study. The letter, where is it now, Monsieur Ashworth? A long pause. Ashworth reached into his inside breast pocket and produced an envelope. He placed it on the occasional table beside him, without looking at it. I burnt the letter he sent, Ashworth said, his voice flat. The envelope is what remained. Because, Poirot said, not unkindly, a letter in the possession of the police would have consequences, even in the death of the writer. You are a practical man. He turned to Eleanor. Madame Ashworth, you confronted the alderman on the morning of the murder, and you threatened him with exposure of his own financial irregularities. You had documentation. You left him alive. You did not return. Everything you told me was true. He paused. But you have known, from the moment you heard the news of the alderman's death, who was responsible. You have known because you know, better than anyone in this room, the character of the man who did it. A man who watches quietly, who absorbs, who endures the suffering of those he cares for until the endurance reaches its limit, and then acts, not out of fury, but out of a terrible, deliberate calm. He turned, at last, to Dr. Oliver Maitland. The room was very quiet. Maitland was looking at Poirot, with the expression of a man who has been expecting this moment, and has prepared himself for it, not by composing defences, but by arriving at a state of quietude that has by degrees come to resemble, though it is not quite, acceptance. Dr. Maitland, Poirot said. He spoke more gently now than he had spoken to the others. You are the murderer of Hercule Beaumont. No one moved. Outside, A rook called once from the garden's oak tree. You had access to the medication. You knew its dosage, its mechanism, its lethal threshold for a man of Beaumont's age and cardiac condition. You had access to the apartment through the connecting door, which the household knows is unlocked. You entered on the afternoon of the 14th, between 3 and 5, I believe, when the apartment was unoccupied, and you introduced a sufficient quantity of the digitalis preparation into the alderman's personal decanter. Not the glass, the decanter. You knew he would pour from it in the evening. You knew the habit because you had observed it at one of the hall's social dinners, where Beaumont's after-dinner routine was unremarkable and therefore unguarded. Maitland said nothing. You were on the east exterior that evening, or near it, visible from the east corridor window, at approximately 7:30. You were checking, I believe, whether the window showed any sign of disturbance, whether anyone had entered after you. The thread from your overcoat on the fire escape bracket confirms your proximity to the east wing exterior. Still nothing. You searched the correspondence file, because you knew the alderman kept records of his financial irregularities, the same records Eleanor had been gathering, and you intended to ensure that the evidence of the blackmailing arrangement could be found by the police rather than suppressed. You wished, in your own way, to see the truth emerge even as you concealed the crime. And the letter from the blotting pad, Vivienne said quietly. Her voice was very steady. He took the letter to Reginald, didn't he? After. Poirot looked at her with something close to compassion. I believe, Doctor, Maitland took the letter from the alderman's escritoire before the man had sent it, perhaps before the scullery girl arrived to deliver it downstairs, meaning that the letter Ashworth received was an earlier draft, and that Maitland destroyed the final version. He paused. The final version, I suspect, contained a specific threat regarding Miss Beaumont personally, not merely the affair, but something more directly injurious. He was going to tell the papers, Vivienne said, that the arrangement was, that I had been part of it, that I had facilitated knowingly. Her voice had dropped to nearly nothing. He told me precisely what he intended to write. The room was silent again. So, Poirot said, and now his voice had the quality not of accusation, but of elegy. Dr. Maitland, a man who has watched a good woman endure humiliation in silence, who has watched a predator disguise himself as a benefactor, who has watched a moral corruption unfold that the law, in its practical limitations, would likely not have addressed in any timely fashion, who has seen the instrument of that corruption sit in this house and sharpen its weapons on the very eve of its greatest opportunity. He looked at the physician steadily. You are a man who has spent his life repairing damage, and you saw damage, here, that you calculated you could prevent, definitively. Maitland finally spoke. The alderman, he said, and his voice was level, measured, the voice of a man stating a clinical conclusion, had a heart condition that was terminal. He would have been dead within 2 years regardless. The medication, in the hands of a physician, was efficient. He paused. I make no claim that what I did was lawful. I am aware it was not lawful. I will say only that I have weighed it, in the days since, against the alternative, and I have not yet found it wanting. Poirot looked at him for a long time. You knew, Poirot said at last, that I would find you. I supposed you would, Maitland replied quietly. I knew who Trent had called. I am familiar with your reputation, and yet you did not flee. No. Maitland looked at him steadily. I did not flee. Chapter 8. What the Grey Cells Know. Inspector Hawkins arrested Dr. Oliver Maitland at 11:15 on the morning of the 16th of October, 1932. The arrest was conducted with proper formality and without incident. Maitland accompanied the inspector without resistance, pausing only at the door of the yellow drawing room to turn back, briefly, and look at the assembled faces. Ashworth's rigid and shattered, Eleanor's still and composed, Vivienne's turned away, Durrant's lowered, with the expression of a man taking leave of a landscape rather than of people, as though what he was leaving was the world he had known, rather than the individuals within it. Then he was gone, and his footsteps could be heard diminishing down the corridor, and then the front door opened and closed, and there was the sound of a motorcar starting in the drive. The room held its silence for a long time after. It was Vivienne who spoke first. She said, almost to herself, He did it for me. He did it, Poirot said, sitting down for the first time since the gathering had begun. For several people at once, as compassionate people often do. He did it for you, and for Madame Ashworth, and for Monsieur Ashworth, and for the idea of what Ashenford Magna might become under its new member, rather than under its new creditor. He paused, and he did it, perhaps, a little for himself, for the doctor who has watched suffering for 30 years and was not, in the end, prepared to watch it continue when the instrument of it was so precisely within his power. Ashworth looked at him from across the room. "What will happen to him?" "He will be tried," Poirot said simply. "The evidence is adequate for a conviction. Whether the jury will find it adequate for the full charge, in the circumstances, that is for 12 English citizens to decide, and I will not pretend to know what they will make of it." "He is guilty," Ashworth said. "Yes," Poirot agreed. "He is guilty. These are not always the same thing, the guilty and those who deserve punishment. Sometimes they coincide precisely, and sometimes," he made a small movement of his hands, "the cases are more complicated." Eleanor Ashworth rose from her chair. She crossed the room to the window and stood looking out at the garden, the autumnal garden, the depleted roses, the grey English sky that seemed to have decided, permanently, on November. When she turned back, her face held the particular expression that Poirot had seen on it from the beginning, that quality of finding things both devastating and, on some interior frequency, expected. "He knew it would be you," she said to Poirot. "Oliver knew it would be you. He told me, the morning after the murder, he said to me, 'I hope to God it's Poirot they bring in, because if it has to come out, I'd rather it came out properly.'" Poirot considered this with the complicated feeling it deserved. "He paid me a generous compliment," he said finally. "I am not certain I have fully earned it." "You found the truth," Eleanor said. "I found the truth," Poirot agreed. "Whether I have done well or ill by finding it, I am not tonight able to determine. Perhaps in time." He touched his moustaches in the habitual gesture of a man seeking, in small physical order, the certainty that larger questions deny him. "But I will say this, madame. The truth, once it exists, does not benefit from concealment. The alderman was a blackmailer. He is dead. Those facts will now be known, and in their knowing, certain other facts about certain members of this household become less weaponizable than they were. This is not nothing." He rose. He collected his hat, which Bridges had retained in the entrance hall with the admirable discretion of the professional servant, and his overcoat, and he stood for a moment in the doorway of the yellow drawing-room, looking back at the arrangement of people who were now in the process of becoming, each in their own way, different people than they had been on the evening of October 14th. Reginald Ashworth would go to Parliament. Whether he would go as a better man for this experience, or merely as a more cautious one, was a question that Poirot felt he lacked the authority to answer. Eleanor would continue the performance of her marriage with the same dignity that had always characterized it, though perhaps with slightly different interior terms. Vivienne Beaumont would leave Ashenford, this Poirot felt certain of, in the way that one feels certain of the things that have not yet happened but already possess a kind of necessity. Captain Durrant would find a solicitor and a way to make the worst of his circumstances into something manageable, and Oliver Maitland would stand in a court of law and account for what he had done. "Poirot," Poirot said quietly, in the doorway, to no one in particular. For he had the habit, when a case arrived at its end, of addressing himself in the third person, as though offering the conclusion to some other version of himself who had not yet heard it. Poirot wonders, sometimes, whether the little grey cells are sufficient, whether the mind, however fine, is adequate to the task of final judgment. He paused. From somewhere beyond the window, the Market Square clock was striking noon. He concludes that they are not. The little grey cells find the truth, that they are sufficient for. But what to do with the truth, when the truth is this? He looked, for a last moment, at the room, at the altered faces, at the fire that had burned down to its orange embers. That is a question for the heart, and the heart, alas, is not always equal to it. He went out. 3 months later, at the Winter Assizes in Storefield, Dr. Oliver Maitland was tried for the murder of Alderman Hartley Beaumont. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and returned a verdict of guilty of manslaughter, not murder, on the grounds of provocation and the absence of prior malice, a verdict that surprised the prosecution, satisfied no one entirely, and may, in its imperfect way, have represented what the law can offer in place of wisdom. Maitland was sentenced to 3 years and served 18 months before being quietly released. The Storefield Waterworks contract was never signed. Reginald Ashworth served 1 parliamentary term and did not stand for re-election. Vivienne Beaumont left Ashenford in November and was not, in any account available to this record, heard from in the village again. Eleanor Ashworth remained at Ridgeway Hall. Hercule Poirot returned to London on the noon train, ate a late supper of excellent quality, and began, that same evening, the letter to a colleague in Brussels that he had been postponing for 3 weeks. He did not, for many days, think about the case, and when he did think about it, he thought not about the solution, which was, in its way, clean enough, but about Oliver Maitland's face at the door of the drawing room, turning back for that last look, and about the question of whether a man who kills to prevent suffering is, in the deepest sense, a physician still. He reached no conclusion. He considered the question, as he considered many such questions, the appropriate one for the little grey cells to live with, rather than to resolve. The end.